completing the physical survey is only part of what you need to do in order to really understand a neighborhood. The other part is the archival research. Another issue that's going to start to arise once you start your archival research is also how to organize all this stuff. So those are the topics I'm going to talk about today. There are 3 steps in terms of doing any kind of archival research, but especially in this particular circumstance where we're doing the survey first and then really moving on to the report stage. So the first step is going to be to find the construction date of every house in the survey. The second is to find information about the neighborhood development. And the third is to put that in the context of trends in the United States. So let's talk about the construction date first. In the survey, you're going to input the construction date as a 4-digit year. So 1952, 1968, etc. That format, by the way, has to be followed to the letter. You can't just say circa or in between or 1960s or something. It has to be exact because that is very important for the data analysis stage, which will come later. Now, ideally, to do this, you'd use deed research. This is the best way to get any kind of dating completed. But obviously, it's not going to be possible this year. And furthermore, honestly, it's not always possible even in other circumstances, right? You might have limited time or limited access to various archives, clerk's offices, etc. So I'm going to teach you how to do this in other ways. Very luckily for us, we do have online resources, and that's going to help you quite a bit. So whenever possible for the properties in this survey, you're going to use the archival resources that we have on the Historic Preservation Department website. So I have that link highlighted. It's under Current Students, Archival Resources, and there's a huge page and then lots of subpages that cover archival resources. Now, what I'm not going to give you is exactly where in those archival resources the dates are. And I'm not going to tell you which houses the archival resources are available for and not. This is because, honestly, at this point in your education, you should be able to do this research yourself, really start to explore these resources, figure out which ones are relevant, which ones aren't, and go from there. So what I want you to do is to kind of do a deep dive into that archival resources page and figure out where the relevant information is. When you can use that site, I want you to say in the survey form exactly where you found it, what the name of that resource is, and then you can move on. However, unfortunately for us, the construction date is not going to be available for all of the properties with these resources. There are some that just aren't there. So for those, what you're going to have to do here is to use the Fred GIS website, which is run by the city. So if you just Google Fred GIS, it'll pull it up for you. You can do searches geographically through the map, or you can just input an address and it'll give you the relevant information. Now, please bear in mind that many, if not most of the dates in Fred GIS are incorrect. They're not like way off usually, but they're often a few years off. So whenever possible, don't just take the Fred GIS number, the date on Fred GIS, and just trust it. Please try to look around and see if you can find more information. So for instance, are nearby houses or houses of similar design in the neighborhood, were they built in the same date or not? If they were, probably that's the correct date. And also trust the visual evidence. Does the house look way newer or way older than what Fred GIS says? Well, then, try to figure out what's happening there. So again, if you have to use Fred GIS, when you put in the evidence for the date on the survey form, say so that you use Fred GIS. But please also tell me how you tried to confirm that date, because again, those dates are often incorrect. All right. Step number 2 is the neighborhood development. So the neighborhood development in the case of Normandy Village is actually quite straightforward because It really developed very quickly in the post-war era. So it should not be that hard to find sources that write about this. That said, this is where you really want to focus on primary sources and only supplement with secondary sources. The point of this is to develop a timeline of how the neighborhood was developed. So what is a primary source? Well, a primary source is a source that was written at the time, right? It's not referencing that stuff. It's actually about that stuff. So things like deeds, building permits, newspaper articles, which will be very useful for you, maps, both historic and current, census documents, planning documents, ads in newspapers, photos, phone books, the Negro Traveler's Green Book, which is extremely important in Fredericksburg because of the extensive segregation that took place here. Postcards, and if you can, interviews of locals are great. Now, some of these resources, honestly, are going to be really tough for you to access, right? Interviewing people right now during COVID is going to be all but impossible. But same with the deeds, right? Finding deeds is going to be a big pain for you because access to the city is limited at this point. But there's a bunch of other stuff that you can definitely use. So please do so. Find those sources as well as you can. In particular, use the Freelance Star. There's lots of stuff there. And try to find relevant information about this neighborhood, how it was developed, why it was developed the way it was. Once that's done, you can place this in a national context. So how is the development of Normandy Village compared to other development at the same time period? Is it typical? Is it atypical? And how, right? What I really care about there is for you to compare Normandy Village to appropriate neighborhoods and trends. So for instance, don't compare Normandy Village to New York City, right? They're completely different. It doesn't make any sense. Make sure that you try to compare this neighborhood to other similar neighborhoods at similar time frames. Otherwise, it's not really a relevant comparison. Okay, this is where you're going to use mostly secondary sources. So things like books, journal articles, brochures, interpretive panels, for instance, at museums or just out and about. That stuff is going to be very helpful to understand how Normandy Village compares to, everything else. And a lot of these sources, especially books and journal articles, you can probably find online. Websites are fine, a good place to start. And Google Books, that kind of thing. So you should be able to find lots and lots of books on this stuff. Eventually, what you're going to do is build a timeline of this neighborhood. And I can already tell you what it's going to look like. It's going to look something like this. So this neighborhood used to be the fairgrounds for Fredericksburg. Then it was kind of outside the city and not that important until the 20th century when it was annexed, which you'll need to document. And then the Route 1 bypass was built. And once the Route 1 bypass was built, then that land became extremely valuable to develop, at which point it developed. So it's relevant that all of this has to do with all the post-war issues that we've talked about before in classes like 209, things like suburbanization, things like Title II, things like the GI Bill, people having more cars, being more car dependent, etc. Another thing that's going to be very relevant for this neighborhood is segregation, because when this neighborhood was built, it was very much a segregated neighborhood, whites only at the time. And that is going to have an impact on who has lived there historically. And then finally, you're going to bring the history all the way to the present and talk about recent changes. So things like the canal path being built, the hospital being developed further, things like that, that have allowed for more development in and infill changes in Normandy Village. But that's pretty much what you're going to build. All right. Now, before you freak out, this is not something you need to do in a single step. This is going to take you quite a while through the end of October to do. Right now, all you need to worry about is the build date. That's all you need to do right now, okay? So focus on the build date, find the build date for the 5 buildings that you've been assigned. Don't worry about the rest just yet. When you go out in the neighborhood, you're going to start getting a feel for it. I do recommend that you drive around or walk around the neighborhood and see what's there. But just for right now, focus on the build date. Once you're done with that, once you're done with the survey part, that's when you're going to do the primary and secondary research. And in particular, you're going to need to synthesize them, right? You're going to need to bring them together to show what's in Normandy Village, how is it significant. And so you're going to want to do the research in segments, in thematic segments, so that you can fill in any gaps that you have. Which brings me finally to the data organization. Right now, as you're doing just dates, I mean, it's not really all that challenging because you can just input it into the survey as you work. But once you start working on the contextual analysis, on all the primary research for Normandy Village, that's going to get a lot more challenging because you're going to start working as a team. And that means that communication is really important so that you work smart instead of, duplicating each other's work. So in order to do this, I would strongly recommend that you use either Google Docs or another online system. And I don't mean just pass a Word doc or Excel around. That doesn't work. You need to do something that is accessible for everybody online so that people don't duplicate each other's work without realizing it. That's the worst waste of time. Please avoid doing that. So develop these Google Docs and then assign tasks, right? So say, this person is going to do the research regarding the fairgrounds, or this person is going to look at all the census documents. But start assigning those tasks and keep track of the research done as you work. I would recommend using a spreadsheet as opposed to a Word document for that, because that way you can more easily order things. So figure out, for each item, maybe, what kind of item it is, the title, the author, the date, all the stuff you need for a bibliography, but also who found it, when you found it, where you found it. So is there a URL link, for instance, or was it at a particular library? And any significant quotes that you find, or images or anything like that, and what page they're on. So that way, everything will be ready to go once you're ready to put this into an actual history. Similarly, with the history, start with a blank text document, right? Either a Google Doc or Word or whatever. But make sure, again, that it's online so that you can all collaborate and work on it. And then use headings and subheadings and subheadings if you want to start organizing your thoughts. And that way, once you find that, okay, we have this section, but we don't know what to write here, you can fill that in. All right. The more organized you are at the outset, the easier it's going to be to get through this without wasting your time. So I would definitely recommend crossing your T's and dotting your I's now so that, in like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, you're not just like, oh my gosh, we have this whole, subsection where we don't have anything. And then, having to do that work at the last minute. So definitely being organized is crucially important here. Now, that said, I want to emphasize that you're not starting with this just yet. Right now, all you need is the dates, all right? But I want you to start putting the rest of the stuff on your horizon so that you know what to expect in the weeks to come. I'm going to talk more about the CRS report in the next week or so. So at that point, I'll give you more about the entire outline of what you're writing. But the big thing to note here is that if you want, you can start doing this research right now. And if you run across something as you're trying to find dates, for instance, you can go ahead and save that information, have a place to save it, so that, in 2 weeks or a month, you're not like, oh man, I saw this in September and I don't remember where it is. All right, we will talk about this extensively on Tuesday. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you very much, everybody.